the next presentation.
Cool. Thank you, Commissioner Paratikin. It's really great to be here. See a lot of familiar names on the line, some new names as well. First of all, I'm really excited to dive into the report that the team here just shared, and I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about some real world programs, as well as at least from my perspective, why a lot of this work really matters here. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to do my best to be really quick, but it goes without saying several of these things merit their almost own deep dive sessions. So I'm going to give a quick overview on WeaveGrid and managed charging. I think we have a lot of experts. In some cases, you're the foremost experts in some of your states on these issues. So I'm looking forward to the discussion later. Where I really want to spend more time here today is talking about some of the bits the last presentation focused on around why these distribution issues really matter and why distribution optimization is important. What are the different types of charging technologies that can be deployed for managed charging? And then lastly, how different types of data systems can provide more or less benefits for utilities, their customers, and the grid. So going ahead, 2 slides, Robert. I'm going to keep you on your toes here. You have these cover slides and you're like, somebody else is working with them, and here we are. So yeah, quickly on WeaveGrid. WeaveGrid is a software company. We really focus on providing tools around planning, program operations and managed charging, and customer and driver engagement. We have 3 stakeholders that we're really trying to support with our software: EV drivers, automakers and charging companies, and then utilities themselves. And we're running utility programs throughout the US, from Oregon and California to Minnesota and Michigan, over to Maryland and New Jersey, and down the Southeast in Georgia, Alabama, and down in the territories like Puerto Rico. So going to the next slide. Look, lots of knowledge here. I think a lot of time has been spent as part of this working group around things like more passive managed charging programs, EV rates, different tools to provide carrots and sticks to get charging off peak. There's been a lot of pilots and programs over time focused on demand response, building on efforts around thermostats and seeing what can we do to get EV charging off of coincident peak load. Where I'm going to be focusing more in this presentation is around those 3rd and 4th boxes. What are other types of sophisticated optimizations we can be using to really take advantage of the flexibility of EV charging to match up with more granular pricing signals at the hourly or sub-hourly level? And then, of course, where we're concerned about a lot of the impacts, particularly in the near term around the distribution system, and what we can be doing in terms of programs to optimize for distribution system constraints and make sure this transition to electric vehicles is as affordable as we can make it. So Robert, thanks again for whirling through the slides here, and let's jump ahead 2 more. So I'll start really kind of kicking this off in that we've spent a lot of time as an industry, with utilities, with commissions and staff, spending a lot of time invoking Charles Dickens and saying things like, you know what, EVs can be the best of times or the worst of times. Another thing that comes up here is, to some extent, what is everything we could be doing to get charging off peak? And if there's one of the takeaways that I'd love for you to have from this presentation, is that itself is a bit of a double-edged sword. Yes, from a G&T perspective, getting charging off peak is really good. But from a distribution system, it really depends. And it is important to, yes, we often start at the top with the generation system, but starting at the customer's home and the service panel, and then the secondary service and the transformers and the feeders. A lot of that stuff was not designed with the idea of these new EV loads coming onto the system. And going to the next slide, this is important to note because EV charging and EVs are pretty unique. We have this great legacy of different programs and different models around a lot of different loads in folks' homes and commercial buildings. EV loads present a new challenge for us in terms of how we think about building infrastructure, customer behavior, as well as software and other techniques to help optimize that charging. Right now, EV load's doubling every couple of years. I think it's well noted in this group that it's spiky. It's easy to see chargers in customers' homes showing up at 10 kW or greater. And there's these interesting aspects of, well, is this unidirectional, bidirectional? These technologies have a lot of data, they're hyper-connected. How can we best use these technologies too in these programs? Going ahead to the next slide here. So yeah, just pause here. I know there's quite a few folks that come to this through cost of service and rates. And I think this study from BCG, there's a lot of others like the work of Kevala and Enrail that have highlighted some of these things too. But something BCG, looking at this left, I really appreciate this study for highlighting is when you think about new EV load coming onto the system, yes, it's a cost causer in terms of potentially adding to the needs for G&T, but where we're really seeing that new load show up and impact costs is potentially around the distribution system. But yeah, I think there's some folks on this call that are involved with grid modernization and distribution system planning. But for those that aren't, like, yes, substations matter here, but particularly for EV loads, again, I'll remind you, it's about the feeders, transformers, secondary service, and whether we need to upgrade those or not. Something that to me is very interesting in this space is that for good or for bad, depending on your perspective, EVs generally aren't showing up that much on coincident peak. So programs designed for that have had some issues with cost effectiveness and impacts because there's not that much EV charging, at least today with early adopters with big batteries happening on peak. Where there's more potential, and again, potential, I think the big question here is, can we capture it, is on the opportunities to help defray and defer a lot of those distribution costs. I'm not here to say that there's not going to need to be any distribution investment. There will be. The question is, how do we do it in a thoughtful way that can lead to some of the bits that different advocates have promised around putting downward pressure on rates. So going ahead, talking about some of what these programs can look like in practice. One more right here. So we often talk about the flexibility of EV load. It's a different flexibility than something like AC, where we're talking about hundreds of thousands of thermostats being turned off for 15 minutes each and cascading. Each EV driver, each EV customer generally is really flexible, and you can roll that up even more. This is good data to keep in mind. The average EV driver on an average day is parked at home for about 12 hours. When they plug in, not everyone plugs in every day, they're plugged in for about 10 hours. And the average charging session, sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less, but on average it's 2 hours. So you look at that and it's like, Mathias is plugged in for 10 hours here, he is charging for 2. You can do a lot with that from an automation perspective. If you give me another click here, Robert. You can, yes, move that charging off peak behaviorally or through software. You can also follow a pricing signal and move it to the times when they're the most renewables on the system or when the hourly pricing are at their lowest. If you have a system that has a lot of prices, you can move, of course, to different times. And yeah, it goes without saying, there's some interesting applications with how you use V2X technologies for grid dispatch and demand response, or for resiliency services like home backup. Going to the next bit, I think it's really important to talk about the customer experience here, which is like customers are opting in and allowing for control of their charging. It's really important to think about the driver experience. The way WeaveGrid works and some other companies in this space set the programs up. We allow drivers to say, hey, when do I need my vehicle fully charged on weekdays and weekends? We offer a lot of flexibility to customers to say, you can opt out of events whenever you need to. Typically, those are pretty low. And yeah, it goes without saying that our goal is each time a customer plugs in, we are seeking to schedule, seeking to shift that charging to the best times for that customer, depending on the grid conditions and the location where they're charging. If you go to the next slide, let's actually talk about start talking about some of the data. On the left, this scenario's been conceptualized for a while, but we can start to see it in real world applications. It's pretty easy to encourage everybody to charge during off-peak times. It's not hard to schedule charging. It's even easier to control the charging to shift to that. Look at that spike. That's great from a GNT perspective. A distribution system planner says, whoa, that's going to be pretty gnarly. On the middle, an RTO ISO forecast, a little bit different, targeting that charging to be at a little bit of a later time. Even higher non-coincident peak, you start to ask, what does the rest of the load look like? But it really kind of highlights that, yeah, you can serve this flexibility. If you give one more click here, Robert, it's worth highlighting. This is, I think, the goal about a lot of this is, yes, let's optimize for different layers. So of course we want to optimize for GNT, but what can we be doing to reduce that non-coincident peak as much as possible? And the next slide here is more of a real world application, highlighting some work that we've been doing in Maryland recently. This is one feeder, 880 drivers, really trying to take a look at, okay, what can we do? On the left, that's model charging, assuming that everyone's charging starts as soon as they plug in. On the right, that's a scenario where distribution optimization is being deployed. The orange lines, of course, the boxes around the peak coincidence windows generally. And you can see like, yes, GNT, the coincident peak is being reduced. But I want folks to take away the other aspect. If you click on this again, Robert, it's about that non-coincident peak too, and how it's touching the distribution system. Being able to optimize that charging in order to impact the distribution system. Again, one of these aspects that's really important for maintaining affordability across the system, and bring on all this new EV load. So that's a quick bit on distribution. Talk about two other bits. I get a lot of questions, going ahead 2 slides, Robert, around charging technologies. There's a lot of different options to help meet the goals that I was highlighting earlier. I think network chargers can serve as an excellent foundation, and nearly everybody can participate so long as their charger has the ability to connect to Wi-Fi or telecommunications networks. Where I sit, I get a lot of questions about telematics. WeaveGrid came to market in the early days around telematics. And this is an important part I want everyone to take away in this area, which is there's no one type of telematics. And in fact, telematics aren't created equal. They really vary in terms of quality based on one, how the telematics is being accessed, and two, of course, by makes and models of the automakers. Going to the next slide, telematics to me really means the data, communications, and controls in the vehicle. There's a couple different ways to access that. One, most traditionally, is different automakers doing this with utilities and different companies like WeaveGrid that are seeking to focus in this area, which is accessing the CAN bus in the car and utilizing the utilities OEM-facing application, leveraging all the monitors and sensors and equipment the utilities have to have the best access to the data, communications, and controls that enable managed charging. Of course, another pathway here, which has been in place since the 1980s, involving clean air compliance, which is the OBD2 port, which is typically used for diagnostics and again, air testing of vehicles. The third aspect, this is really about new technology and builds on a lot of work that's happened in financial tech, which is this concept of scraping or using snapshot approaches to try to capture the data. In this case, customers are consenting and authorizing third parties to access what's available in their customer apps. That can be web, or it can be a customer mobile app. And I'll say, yeah, you can get data, communications, and control in this forum, depending on the automaker, but it's going to be more limited. What the OEM has access to versus what you have access to through a customer mobile app is going to be pretty different. I get a lot of questions around how can this scraping be utilized, but I think it's an important concept for this group too around, okay, it has been used often in financial tech for things like better understanding personal insights and data and some transfers. I think it's another question that we're all learning about is how effective can that pathway really be used when it comes to data and managed charging to serve grid needs. And so the next slide, it's almost considered as a takeaway. I want to be sensitive to folks' time here. But yeah, there's a lot of focused efforts around pathway 1, and automakers generally are building out energy management systems in their cars to better serve the grid and a lot of these customer program applications. But it's important for utilities and commissions and their staffs to understand with these programs, when using telematics, are we leveraging pathway 1? Are we leveraging pathway 3? Over time, what are the implications? You can see that in some jurisdictions. Say some automakers don't like pathway 3 in particular and have done different things to minimize access through pathway 3. It's happened in a couple different jurisdictions. You might see a report around, say, like Ford blocking access or Ford drivers leaving a program, and that's in part because they've prioritized around pathway 1 over pathway 3 in their support for a lot of these programs. Lastly, Robert asked me to talk about data for a little bit here. I'll say on one side of it, the telematics, go ahead 2 slides, Robert. The charger data and the telematics data can be used for a whole lot of use cases. Of course, this requires customer consent, cybersecurity and privacy protections. And with all these things, the data is as good as the use case. But if you're utilizing this data, there's a lot you can do from a planning perspective, helping customers behave better for the grid, and of course, optimization in a lot of these programs. The other side of this, though, is how to use utility system data to improve the optimizations. If you go to the next slide, I've been really focused on some more residential applications, but like everyone here knows that fleet charging, multifamily charging, commercials all relevant here. And utilities have been investing through grid modernization proceedings and rate cases in a lot of these IT and OT systems. I'll say here on the next slide, you can do a lot from the managed charging perspective without any of those integrations. That first scenario, this is now from a Northwestern utility. Again, you can see these scenarios around what does the charging look like when it's unmanaged? What does it look like if customers are optimizing for a time of use rate? And what does it look like if you're using this distribution optimization technique? You can, again, if you're looking at EV charging on its own, you can do a lot to reduce those non-coincident and coincident peaks. But look at this next slide. Here with a Pacific Northwestern utility, we're utilizing the historian PI data from their SCADA to better understand what's happening at the feeder level on all other loads. On the top, we're doing that distribution optimization, but without that data, we're still adding some to those local peaks. Down below, with that additional context, we can do more to fill in those troughs. Again, this is real program data from a deployment, and yeah, in that case, we're able to reduce the net peak by 95%. So can you do a lot of this without those integrations? Absolutely, but the integrations do enable more value to be unlocked. And yeah, I'll leave it there. A little bit on distribution optimization and technologies and data here.
Thanks, Mathias. I appreciate that presentation. It's a lot to dig into, and I definitely have a couple questions that I wrote down over the course of it. But I'll wait because we have one final presentation before we get to the open Q&A period, and that is from Erin Monroe from Madison Gas and Electric. Erin, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for giving me some of your time to talk about MG&E's Charge Ahead program. First, I'll start off with a little bit about MG&E, if you want to advance one slide. So we are, I think, the smallest investor-owned utility in the country. We're a really tiny utility. We have our population in our service area is about 500,000 people. We serve primarily the Madison metropolitan area. We've got about 163,000 electric customers, and we have a few more on the gas side because we have some gas territories kind of further west. But that's a kind of us in a nutshell. I want to go ahead, advance. So MG&E, as with most utilities, we have committed to substantial reductions in our carbon footprint, 80% reduction by 2030 and net zero carbon electricity by 2050. And I won't go into the details on this slide, but electric transportation is really viewed as one of the pillars to help us work with our customers to make those carbon reductions. Go ahead, advance. So we have a number of EV programs that are currently in the market. The first one is Charge at Home. This one's been out since, I think, 2016 era. And this is a program where MG&E will provide a charger at a customer's home for a 7-year term, excuse me, it's a 10-year term for a monthly fee. We also have a pretty extensive public charging network. We've got over 50 chargers out there. This photo here on the bottom is our EV charging hub, which is kind of right downtown in Madison. We've got 8 fast chargers there. And then we also have like the top picture, we have we're deploying some pole mounted chargers for curbside charging where we have a high density of multifamily customers, and we provide, if customers tell us that they get an EV, if our customers do, they can enroll in our EV owners group, which offers a small discount at those chargers. That's primarily so we can get data on people that are purchasing EVs. We have our Charge Ahead program. That's the one I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on. We also have apartment and workplace charging programs. Those are kind of similar in nature to the Charge at Home. And then we have a fleet advisory services and fleet rate program. The fleet advisory services will basically look at your fleet data and kind of determine which vehicles would be good candidates for electrification and kind of how they would charge, where they park, where would be a good place to put chargers and things like that. And then we have a rate. The rate is intended to help fleet customers sort of step into their demand over time. So as the chargers are utilized more, the demand portion of their bill is less impactful. And so, you know, I think it's an 80% discount in your demand rate, one of your demand charges the first year, and then it's 60, 40, 20 until those charges you're fully stepped into. So next slide, please. So the Charge Ahead program, so quick description. So this was a small scale. It started as a really small scale demonstration project in 2020. We had about 30 Tesla drivers on it. And it was basically to see, like, does this actually work? Through that pilot, they did a small an evaluation of it and then filed for a larger expansion of the pilot with our commission. We got approval in 2022. We can enroll up to 200 participants in this round. The way that the program is designed from a customer's perspective is the drivers earn rewards or save money for allowing MG&E to shift their charging to off-peak time. So we sort of have two populations that are allowed to participate, both standard rate and TOU. So we can see some differences, and I'll show you that in a little bit. If you're a TOU customer, your benefit is through your bill savings. If you're a standard rate customer, you can earn a reward. It's either $4 in the winter or $8 in the summer months. Next slide, please. So this is a telematics-based program. We like that because there's no additional equipment needed. We use the vehicle telematics. If the vehicle, and kind of getting into some of the things that Mathias was talking about earlier, it is limited into which vehicles can currently participate. So our current qualified vehicles are Chevy, Audi, BMW, Tesla, but we do have an option to manage also through ChargePoint chargers. So that's another alternative participation pathway if the customer doesn't have a qualified vehicle. So, next slide, please. So we just launched the program like I said, we got approval in 2022. We launched in 2023. The rollout was intentionally slow at the beginning. Part of this is because the way that the program works is there is a third-party app that customers download onto their phone. And we wanted to make sure that that customer experience was smooth. And so we were very limited in sort of how we brought this online. Kind of we had also made some of our own customizations. There's a participation agreement that customers have to sign and agree to. And so we had to have that integrated into the app. And we just wanted to make sure that that experience was good. So we actually intentionally rolled it out very slowly and very sort of limited batches, primarily through recruitment emails. We emailed participants in our Charge at Home program. So that's the one where we're providing the charger, because we know all of those customers, even if they don't have a qualified vehicle, they would have a qualified charger. So we started there, and then we've sort of broadened it out as we've sort of made tweaks to that process, to that enrollment process, and made sure that that was smooth for customers. And we started expanding our marketing efforts. So we're marketing to members of our EV owners group, which are the self-identified EV owners that I mentioned previously. We're deploying digital ads. We have a website stood up. We're doing a lot of EV events to try to kind of get the word out. To mixed results on that. I can get into that in a little bit as well. But yeah, if you want to go ahead and advance one more slide. Just some preliminary results here. And again, we've only at this point enrolled about a little bit more than 50 customers. So it isn't a huge sample size, but I did think this was a little bit interesting and thought this group might appreciate this. So these are our two different populations. So the population on the left is our RG1. These are our standard rate customers. And you can see the red line there is their unmanaged charging load. So you can see what was happening without managed charging. One interesting thing, and we actually noticed this in our Charge at Home program, which is the one where we provide the charger, we actually see a spike at 9 o'clock, even customers that aren't on a time of use rate, which is sort of interesting. We would expect to see that on customers for our time of use customers, because that's when the peak period ends. And so it was very interesting to us to see that we do see customers, even non-time of use customers, sort of they're initiating their charging around that time at night. I mean, it's not quite as defined as the time of use, but you can see that red line on the left. People coming home from work, I know some people, they do, their chargers are set up that way to initiate programs starting at 9, but I think it was just an interesting thing. We've also probably conditioned some of our customers to think that they're that it's more cost effective to charge at night. So we see that behavior even in customers that are not on a time of use rate. So 9 p.m. is a very important time for us with regard to EV charging. And then you can see how the blue lines, the sort of blue bars there show how the charging is shifted away from that green sort of on peak period. The effect is somewhat, the difference between, the blue and the red is more pronounced on the customers on the standard rate. It says 85% of the charging was shifted to peak on the left and 92% on the right for the time of use, but that does include the behavioral component that we would have seen just from being on time of use anyway. So, all right, next slide. Some of the challenges, I mean, initially, as I mentioned, we did slow roll the rollout of this program. But it has been challenging to get participants. There's, limited vehicle eligibility is a challenge. And I think, as sort of those 3 pathways that Mathias had talked about earlier, were more like the pathway 3. So we have limited vehicle eligibility. So that's been a problem. And I also think like some of the way that we were initially, talking about the program when it was more in a demonstration pilot stage was, testing a new technology. So we are looking at revising a lot of the way that we're talking about the program. We're also looking at potentially exploring referral bonuses for customers, if they can talk to their friends and coworkers who have EVs and just kind of see if we can bring awareness to the program that way. But I would say it has been slow. We anticipated that it would be slow to recruit, and that has definitely proven somewhat challenging. And you can go ahead. And so looking ahead, obviously we're going to be working on increasing our marketing and recruitment. Another thing that we've sort of been learning as this pilot has rolled out is even in a managed charging program, there is some behavioral optimization that is required. So for example, this program is open to customers that use both level 1 and level 2 charging. And what we have noticed is because some people driving a level 1 or charging on a level 1, they're going to need more time to charge. So there's less flexibility in that load. So if that customer doesn't charge their car for 2 days and then they plug in and their state of charge is lower, they're going to need the full 12 hours to charge their car. And so there is less flexibility there for us to shift their charging. And so we're looking to, help those customers, provide them with some signals. Hey, if you're using a level 1 charger, you should probably plug in every night so that your charging period is lower, so that there's more flexibility for us to move that load around. We hope to see expanded vehicle eligibility, but I do understand and know that there are a lot of challenges with that as well. And we want to provide an excellent customer experience. This can be a little difficult for, I participate in the program, so I'm sort of a guinea pig as well. And, even the messaging and is my car smart charging right now? I can't tell. Can I boost? So providing that excellent customer experience, we want to make sure that all of our customers have that as well too. And so we're learning a lot through this pilot about what we can do to improve that as well. All right, and that was everything I have. My contact information is on the slide, so feel free to reach out if you have any questions after the presentation as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Erin. I appreciate it. While you were talking, though, I looked up the size of our smallest IOU in Michigan, and it's 16,500, so about the 10th of the size.
That's actually nice to hear. That's comforting.
Alpina Power Company. Feel free to give them a call and commiserate at some time. All right, so if we could bring all of the speakers back on camera, we'll open it up for question and answer for anybody, for any of the speakers. Feel free to just raise your hand if you have a question that you'd like to ask out loud, or just enter your question into the chat if you would prefer to get a written response. I'm going to start with the first question. So we got a couple different numbers on how much infrastructure investment can be reduced as a result of managed charging. In the first presentation with the DOE and Kevala, I think your slide said that you could reduce infrastructure investment needs by 30%, and then WeaveGrid's presentation said 65%. And I know that we're still early in the process, and I absolutely understand that there are differences in the way that these are calculated and the importance of the different inputs and methodologies that are used to calculate. But I think that just the fact that on this presentation, while we're talking about managed charging and we have two different numbers, that they're pretty different. One is more than double the other. And I think that really just highlights the uncertainty and importance of the assumptions, that especially that we as commissioners and commission staff, that we need to be thinking about, and we need to be thinking about because we're working in the best interest of customers, right? How are we supposed to be doing these calculations properly? Who are we supposed to be looking to as the right number? And I would just love to hear any of the perspectives from either of the presentations, or even you too, Erin, from you, because you probably had to deal with this on the other side as well.
I'm happy to go first on that one. I appreciate the question, Commissioner. There's always the consulting studies and the more detailed planning studies like them. What was presented before mine. Full disclosure, the number you're referencing is a citation from a consultant to help frame, I think, what we could say is the size of the opportunity. I think there's a lot really we could say is like, is that 36% or is that 60%? That's all ex ante stuff though. What I think is most valuable is what are we learning ex post or actually after these projects are being implemented. And I think that's where more of that data I presented later in the deck highlights what we're seeing in kind of real world settings. And is it 30%, 60%? I can look up some of that data and provide more of that for you, but I think that's where the data matters most is, okay, we can argue at length about what we might see. It's really about, well, what are the results and what are we seeing in the field?
Yeah, to start, and Brennan and Chuck, please chime in with the respective approaches for the load heuristics and then the charge agnostic approach versus the local grid aware approach. But a key thing that was underpinning our study was that we were looking at future EV adoption requiring grid expansions on top of an existing infrastructure that would be broadened according to electrification beyond EVs. And so we were having to account for EV load and non-EV load growth in the near term and the potential lumpy nature of that infrastructure. And as Brennan will describe in a sec, we were looking at the dwell times for just home and depot charging for light and medium and heavy duties respectively, as well as strategic placement of charging in areas that were open or kind of green in host and capacity analyses maps. So it really depends on kind of the scope of analysis. Brendan, you can take the baton.
Sure. Yeah, I would also just add that I think that the number that you quote from our study is actually from, it's a grid agnostic and overly simplified heuristic load smoothing approach. So it doesn't really consider other loads that are on these distribution grid assets. It's kind of a very conservative estimate. You know, a lot of these cost savings are also going to be location specific. So you might see a lot more benefit on, you know, even some areas of the system or even on some feeders versus others. So I think in addition to just kind of the top line number, there's a lot of, you know, variability in there that is kind of on a very local basis. And we did, to some extent, I don't know, Chuck, you did mention a little bit the grid aware. I guess this was kind of an alternative charge management strategy that is kind of a part of a sensitivity, just to show that, you know, if you are managing charging based on other loads, kind of, you know, on the shared group of assets, that you can see even more increased savings. I don't know if you want to speak a little bit to the magnitude of those savings that you were able to measure.
Yeah, just to reemphasize and give some numbers to the locational aspect. So we had the one capacity unaware management scenario, which was around the 30-ish% of cost reduction that we described. And then we layered in a more capacity aware, local grid constraint aware scenario that had at minimum no impacts because of what Brennan mentioned around the types of vehicles and chargers that are on a given circuit. We were modeling the manageable loads as specific to the home and depot segments. But if you have a circuit that is only hosting EV charging for, let's say, like a highway stop off or something like that, and there's a dedicated substation or large transformer bank attached to that, then that charging is not as manageable. But on the upper end of that, the figure that I quoted was in the neighborhood of a further 30% savings for feeders that do have those higher electric vehicle penetration populations that can be managed more easily, being those home and depot chargers where dwell times are far extended beyond the scope of when a battery would need to be fully charged for activity the following day.
And to close, really what this is illustrating, this variation, is the import of having rates reflect costs and optimizing the system for whatever grid constraint you're chiefly most worried about. So the basic charging approach, the basic heuristics might be, peak clipping at the generation system level. But if we're dealing with supply chain constraints with respect to service transformers or secondary, you might want to pursue a managed charging at the local level.
Okay, that's really helpful. So I'm hearing it's very dependent on the location, what you're optimizing for, and what you're actually building, what you're connecting. So I think that's I think that makes sense. But just looking at the takeaway for us, like as we're trying to plan for this for the future, maybe we should be hesitant about taking those high level numbers, and we need to be looking more at the specifics of the investment and the needs of on a highly local level. So okay, awesome. I'm seeing that. Okay, good. Thank you. that was super helpful. Ryan, do you have a question?
Yes, slightly different topic. Are you good to move on to this topic? So it's actually from Mathias, and it's related to, I think it's slide 20. Robert, I don't know if you want to bring that up. It's the slide that shows the different flavors of managed charging. And I found this slide really helpful. I think working with the North Carolina Commission and looking at Duke Energy's managed charging pilots and programs, sometimes it's easy to get lost on kind of what type of a pilot or program they are. And so I find this useful as a framework. And we started to see that, Duke Energy has pilots in several of these buckets. And so my question is, if you have any insights, maybe you do, maybe you don't, about when you look at utilities across the country, are they tending to start with passive programs and then move into active programs? And the sort of second question is, are you seeing utilities build strategies that consist of a portfolio of different types of managed charging programs?
Great question. I think, Robert, it's like slide 5 of my deck. That Ryan's.
Oh yeah, sorry. It's it says managed charging programs come in many flavors. Sorry, I was looking at my screen where I have it up. My other screen.
Yeah. So
yeah, right.
In terms of where utilities are starting off, I think that oftentimes it comes from which organizations are taking the pen first when it comes to product development. The distribution folks, so folks know my background. Know some of you from my time at Excel Energy, where I led program strategy and policy around EVs at the company. If the projects start more in the distribution side of the house that's looking at EV adoption right now and saying, wow, we are concerned about some of these impacts on area planning and engineering and distribution operations, the kind of flavor for the program looks very different than, say, if it comes from more of your demand side management stakeholders at the business. I think, again, early days, a lot of the program efforts have been designed to look somewhat like smart thermostat and other offerings around getting that off peak as much as possible, designing things around demand response events. We are seeing much more, though, of this automated managed charging and distribution optimization coming to market. Some as pilots, some now as programs throughout different jurisdictions. And I think that comes down to, one, the technology is in a better place to do those things, is not conceptual. Two, when it comes to looking at the cost benefit analysis, the recognition that we're not really going to see that much peak avoidance on a coincident peak. The cost drivers and the cost to serve are much more around low cost energy hours at like 2 a.m. and of course these distribution aspects. So right now, I think a lot of utilities with that have done a program or two are more focused on the third and fourth buckets, which I think is great that they're being proactive around the ability of the technology and the need for technology in order to, again, try to put this downward pressure on rates and make sure that EVs are done in a way that are cost effective and maintain reliability. On the topic of program flavors, I think the ideal program right now is one that's actually one program that enables different flavors based on the technologies that customers have. So if they have a car that's telematics can provide data accurately but not control, they can have a more passive option. If they have a vehicle that can do more sophisticated optimization, then bring them into the more active managed, and that's true for the chargers as well. Some people are only going to want to give data. Others are very comfortable with the control. Generally, what we've seen when we're giving customers a choice, 70 or 80% opt into the more active managed charging offerings as long as they have right incentives in place. But yeah, this kind of layered approach of some passive, some active based on technology and customer choice is what I see as a best practice in this space right now.
Awesome, thanks.
Thanks. Yeah. There's a question in the chat about clarifying if managed charging is more applicable to home and workplace charging compared to public charging.
Figure some other folks have some thoughts there. A lot of it comes to the flexibility of the charging. When you're at home and your car's parked and plugged in for 10 to 12 hours and it doesn't require any inconvenience, that's great. That happens in workplace often. I think it's it's a cost driver for sure with public charging. I think every EV driver has a fear that they're going to show up at a time that the charging is turned off. So pricing models likely work better in that application than situations where the charging is being controlled or throttled.
Yeah, I might just add from the driver's perspective. So dwell distributions are a lot more variable in public locations. They tend to be more consistent, at home and at work. And I also think that at least, to this point, much of the charging is happening at home. Secondary would be at work. So people who are tending to plug in public are either folks who don't have access to charging by other means, or that really need it. So there might be just a little bit less of an opportunity unless they're able to opt in an easy way for them to take advantage of managed charging in public.
Yeah, and the way that we thought about it was also the opportunity borne by the longer dwell times, more or less. So you have more opportunities to put charge into the battery within the segments that we explored charge management for. And workplace is maybe one that could have a longer dwell time, but is maybe a little more variable. As Mathias already mentioned, public is a little bit harder just because of consumer expectations for what is available to them when they plug in.
Yeah, and a key point that I mentioned earlier is that for some of the charge savings, we were levering public charging that could be fit, not time shifted, but fit in locations where utility maps suggested that there was open grid capacity, available capacity at the local level, so that chargers that would be likely needed could be placed nearby without fundamentally changing the nature of the network. And so I think considering managed charging in its multiple flavors, whether it's like a peak clip effort at the generation level versus a distribution time shift to avoid transformer upgrades, or in this case, strategic placement enabled through transparent utility data. I think there's opportunity for managed charging really everywhere.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, so I'm actually curious. We've had a couple of people mention that that they've participated in a managed charging program. I have also. I know that this is a highly non-representative sample of the population, but if you have participated in a managed charging program, could you just raise your hand? I'm just curious to see how many people on the call right now have actually participated in a managed charging program, like through their utility or through well, I guess just through your utility within EV. None offered. Danielle says none are offered by her utility. I was as a part of the DTE. Okay, really only 4. Okay, interesting. I actually expected that to be a little bit more. Okay, I'll put my hand back down now. Erin, I have a question for you on customer adoption. So you mentioned the difference between communication and customer buy-in versus like a more behind the scenes approach where it's kind of just managed for the customer and like there isn't a lot of active there isn't much active needed by the customer. Which of those works better? Which have you seen to work better? Do customers who are participating in managed charging programs, do they want to be more active and do they want to really like buy into the reason why they're charging at a certain time, or do they just want it to be hands off? I want to be able to get in my car when I want to drive.
Yeah, I think it's more the latter. You know, customers can opt out, you know, if they need to boost, they call that boosting. So ours is like, you know, continuously managed, as opposed to like a demand response type. We're not calling events or anything like that. But, you know, depending on when you need your car, you may opt out of managed charging at any point. We don't see, you know, a ton of it. I think, you know, we do feel like our customers they kind of want to just set it and forget it and let the utility take care of it. We do see customers that you know are opting out enough that they're unfortunately not able to earn the incentive. So we're keeping them in the program because we want to see like if we can bring them in, you know, if that's just a, you know, momentary, you know, they're busy, they need their car, or if we can change their behavior so that they can earn the incentive. So we're keeping them in the program too, to just kind of see what happens over time. But I think, you know, from what we're learning, most customers just set it and forget it. They're not really, you know, they're not really, you know, boosting very often or changing their programming schedule or changing their ready by time. I don't see a lot of additional engagement in beyond, you know, signing up, being registered, and you know, boosting when needed.
I'll add, when we've presented customers, when utilities were working with the presented customers, the choice between passive and active approaches or more behavior or more actively controlled options, customers have chosen active control in greater numbers.
Interesting. And yeah, that could also just be like a correlation between the type of person who has an EV at this point and wants to participate. You know, yeah, it's probably again not a fairly representative sample, but that's interesting to just hear both of your experiences with that so far. Okay, we're coming to the end of our Q&A period. Are there any other questions from anybody in the audience that you'd like to squeeze in before the end? Al, yeah, go ahead. We can't hear you for some reason. I can see you and I can see that you're talking and I can see that you're unmuted. No, still not. if we're not able to get the audio working, you can always just type into the chat and hopefully we'll be able to get an answer that way. Yeah, sorry. I feel slightly responsible for your IT problems right now. I apologize.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, yeah.
All right. I am wondering, in Michigan, we have a lot of chargers where they weren't required to be networked, and as such they are not. And how can they? It seems like the communication is really important. How do we make sure that those with the non-networked chargers are able to participate?
I'm happy to go first there. And Al, are you thinking more non-networked in public settings or home settings, or both? I'll say in the case of home charging, that's where the telematics provides a great additional option. Most cars these days are connected and at least able to provide the data to enable participation in more passive offerings. Fewer are able to do active managed charging in terms of makes and models, but the vast majority of total EVs are able to participate in those active offerings as well. I look to the in-rail DOE Kevala team if there's other aspects that you all see on the more public side of things.
Adding to the home charging first, so understanding that there's a decade or over, I think 2 million vehicles now in the US of potentially non-network charging available. There is a technology that is recently commercialized out of Argonne National Lab called the Smart Charge Adapter, which can take really any non-networked home charger and bring it up to revenue grade metering with local telemetry that connects those chargers and actually has performed frequency regulation in Baltimore Gas and Electric's territory. It is offered commercially now and is a good kind of retrofit option in the case that grid emergencies or constraints are being restrictive in local utilities. And then really thinking about the future, a key part of maximizing grid integration potential is acknowledging the fact that we will have more OEMs coming into the fold. Hopefully they will be making their telemetry open API. But even if they were to make their telemetry accessible and controllable by third parties and utilities, one fact of the matter is that there's probably going to still be a heterogeneous system of smart chargers also. And so a key aspect of moving forward among commissions is to make sure that there are ways to avoid double counting, the case where someone with an old car that doesn't have telematics might buy a new charger and is thus able to seamlessly work despite that difference in capability, where we certainly do not want to leave the smart charger off the table or let people be stranded because the system is fragmented. And so it's really important to harmonize both smart cars, smart chargers, non-networked cars, and non-network chargers. And happy to talk about that during a separate time.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. We do need to move on to the next portion of the agenda, but this I do think it's important to highlight that things are still evolving like that, and we're still trying to get everybody to all the different pieces to work together. So I'd like to thank all of the speakers who came and